Tonight, we journey into the life and philosophy of one of the most enchanting minds of the 20th century, Alan Watts. Over the next few hours, we will explore the profound teachings of a man who helped the Western world rediscover ancient truths that had been waiting patiently in the East. In early childhood, Alan Watts experienced a fever dream that revealed an uncanny sense of spaciousness and mystery. Imagine a small cottage in Chislehurst, Kent, around 1920. A young boy lies in bed, his body warm with fever, his consciousness drifting into that strange territory between waking and sleeping. And there, in that liminal space where the ordinary rules of perception loosen their grip, something extraordinary occurred. The young Alan found himself immersed in visions that seemed to float with an otherworldly clarity. These were not the fevered nightmares one might expect from a sick child. Instead, they carried a quality of spaciousness, of boundless mystery, as if the walls of his small bedroom had dissolved into infinite possibility. The scene unfolds as a young boy lying in bed, mesmerized by visions resembling Chinese landscapes. His mother, Emily Mary Watts, had received silk embroideries and paintings from missionaries returning from China, gifts that decorated their modest home at Rowan Tree Cottage. These images had captured young Alan's imagination long before the fever came, but now, in his altered state, they seemed to come alive. He later wrote of being aesthetically fascinated with what he called a certain clarity, transparency, and spaciousness in Chinese and Japanese art. It seemed to float, he remembered. Imagine that sensation for a moment. Imagine lying in your childhood bed, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, and suddenly perceiving that the boundaries you had always assumed were fixed. The edges of things, the separations between objects, were somehow more fluid than you had been taught to believe. This moment sparked a lifelong inquiry into the nature of consciousness and perception. What is it about certain experiences, certain images, certain states of awareness that can crack open our ordinary way of seeing? Alan Watts would spend the rest of his life exploring this question. Born on the 6th of January 1915 to Lawrence and Emily Watts, he grew up as an only child in the English countryside. His father worked as a representative for the Michelin Tire Company, and the family lived simply. Yet within this unassuming setting, something remarkable was germinating. The boy who learned the names of wildflowers and butterflies, who wandered through the Kent countryside with curious eyes, was already developing an unusual sensitivity to the mystery that hides within ordinary things. That fever dream was not an isolated incident. It was perhaps the first clear signal of a mind destined to question the assumptions that most of us never think to examine. Today, many of us face similar questions about the boundary between imagination and reality. Consider your own life for a moment. Have you ever woken from a dream so vivid that you questioned which state was more real, the dream or your waking life? Have you ever gazed at a landscape, perhaps at dusk when the light softens everything, and felt that the world was somehow more than the collection of separate objects you normally perceive? In our modern age of constant digital stimulation, we rarely allow ourselves the quiet necessary to notice these subtle openings. Yet they are always available to us. The fever dream that visited young Alan Watts is not so different from the moments of unexpected clarity that visit each of us, if only we pay attention. A shaft of sunlight through a window, the sound of rain on a roof, the face of a stranger that somehow seems familiar. These are invitations to look more deeply, and so we begin our journey with this simple but profound insight, the awareness that would eventually transform Alan Watts into one of the most beloved interpreters of Eastern philosophy for the Western world. That awareness did not come from books or lectures or formal training. It came first as a gift, unbidden, to a child lying in bed with a fever. It came through beauty, through the floating quality of Chinese paintings, through the dissolution of ordinary boundaries that illness sometimes provides. As you settle into this evening's contemplation, consider that you too carry within you the capacity for such seeing. The veil between the ordinary and the extraordinary is thinner than we suppose. Let this thought rest gently in your mind as we prepare to follow Alan Watts from that small cottage in Kent into a life of remarkable exploration. For now, simply breathe and allow the mystery to settle around you like evening mist. The fever dream faded, but its lesson remained. In 1920s England, as young Watts discovered Chinese and Japanese art in galleries and books, he recognized the same quality that had visited him in illness, that mesmerizing sense of space. He studied the paintings at length, noticing how their emptiness felt alive. This sparked his curiosity about Eastern conceptions of nature and reality. Imagine, if you will, a young mind encountering for the first time the profound stillness of a Chinese landscape painting. Not the bustling, crowded canvases that dominated Western art of that era, but something entirely different. Mountains emerging from mist, a single scholar's hut nestled in bamboo, and vast expanses of white space that seemed to breathe with possibility. This was not emptiness as absence, but emptiness as fullness, as presence. The young Watts found himself drawn to this paradoxical quality, where what was not there seemed more significant than what was painted upon the silk. What was happening in those quiet moments of contemplation? The traditional Chinese and Japanese masters understood something that had been lost in the Western tradition, that space itself could be alive, that emptiness was not the absence of meaning, but its very foundation. In the serene gardens of the Song dynasty painters, every brushstroke served the whole. Every deliberate empty space, what the Chinese masters called liu bai, carried the weight of infinity. Watts discovered that these artists were not depicting external nature as something separate from the observer, but rather revealing the interconnected flow that exists between consciousness and the natural world. This was his first glimpse into what would become his life's work, understanding that the boundaries we perceive between self and world, between inner and outer, are perhaps more permeable than we imagine. Let that thought rest. As we consider how this early encounter with Eastern aesthetics prepared Watts to question the very foundations of Western individualism. The artists whose work captivated him understood reality not as a collection of separate objects scattered through empty space, but as an indivisible whole where each element participates in every other. A single bamboo leaf in a painting by Xu Wei, or a mountain peak in a work by Seshu, becomes significant not in isolation, but through its relationship to the entire composition. This insight, that meaning emerges through interconnection rather than through the accumulation of discrete details, would later inform Watts's understanding of consciousness itself. The young viewer in those English galleries was unknowingly preparing to become a bridge between two very different ways of perceiving the relationship between self and cosmos. This encounter with Eastern aesthetics marked a turning point in the young Watts's development. He began to understand that what appears empty might actually be full, that what seems absent might be most present. The Chinese masters had discovered something the West had forgotten, that silence has its own eloquence, that space itself can speak. In the years to come, Watts would return again and again to this early revelation, that emptiness is not a void to be feared or filled, but a living presence to be honored. You might experiment with this ancient wisdom in your own contemplation. Notice the pause between words in conversation, the moment of quiet in music, the breathing room in a well-composed image. In these spaces lives the same quality that captivated young Watts, not absence, but a different kind of fullness, patient and profound. What if the spiritual path you're handed as a child isn't the one that leads you home? This question would haunt a young Alan Wilson Watts as he stood at the crossroads between two worlds. Born in 1915 in the English countryside, Watts carried within him the weight of inherited faith, an Anglican Christianity passed down through his mother's missionary lineage, steeped in what he later called the grim and maudlin religious training of muscular Christianity at King's School, Canterbury. But there was something else stirring in his young heart, a fascination with the Far East that began with missionary embroideries and Chinese landscape paintings that seemed to float with a clarity and spaciousness foreign to the heavy gravitas of Victorian religious life. As a teenager, Watts found himself torn between two worlds: the respectable Anglican tradition that society expected him to embrace, and the mysterious wisdom of Buddhism that whispered promises of a different kind of awakening. The crisis intensified during his formative years when he spent holidays in France with Francis Croshaw, a wealthy patron who introduced him to Buddhist texts and practices. Here was a man who embodied the paradox of spiritual seeking, simultaneously rooted in European culture while embracing Eastern wisdom. For Watts, this encounter became a moment of profound reckoning. He was forced to choose not between right and wrong, but between inherited conformity and authentic discovery. The Anglican Christianity he had been taught felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit, spiritually constraining, intellectually suffocating, and emotionally barren. Throughout my schooling, he later reflected, my religious indoctrination was grim and maudlin. The young Watts realized that faith imposed from without often becomes a cage, while authentic spiritual exploration emerges from within. This wasn't rebellion for its own sake, but a courageous act of spiritual integrity that would define his entire philosophical journey. When Watts chose Buddhism over convention, he didn't simply switch religious affiliations. He embarked upon a path of radical self-discovery that would transform how Western minds understand Eastern wisdom. At just 16, he became secretary of the London Buddhist Lodge, immersing himself in meditation practices and philosophical texts that spoke to his soul in ways that Anglican theology never could. The Buddhist teachings offered something the young Watts had been desperately seeking: a spiritual framework that honored both human consciousness and the natural world, that saw no fundamental separation between the sacred and the ordinary. Chinese and Japanese art had shown him a vision of existence where space itself had depth and meaning, where transparency and clarity were not just aesthetic qualities, but ways of being. Buddhism promised to help him live within that spaciousness, rather than the cramped corridors of conventional religious thought. This choice represented more than personal preference. It was an act of intellectual courage that would later enable him to bridge Eastern and Western philosophies for countless seekers. Today, Watts's struggle feels remarkably familiar to many who find themselves questioning inherited beliefs in an increasingly complex world. Like the young Watts, we too stand at crossroads between tradition and authenticity, between what we've been told to believe and what our deepest wisdom tells us is true. His choice to embrace Buddhism wasn't about rejecting all spiritual inheritance, but about the courage to follow the path that leads us home to our authentic selves. In a world where inherited frameworks often feel inadequate for contemporary challenges, Watts's example reminds us that genuine spirituality requires not blind adherence to tradition, but thoughtful exploration of what actually awakens the human spirit. Sometimes the spiritual path that calls to us is not the one we were handed, but the one we discover through honest questioning and courageous choice. In 1931 London, 16-year-old Watts became secretary of the Buddhist Lodge, revealing a remarkable early commitment. Picture this young man, barely past childhood, already seeking something beyond the conventional religious training of his boarding school days. While his peers were absorbed in typical adolescent pursuits, Watts was stepping into the role of organizational leadership within a community dedicated to Eastern wisdom. This wasn't merely teenage curiosity, it was a profound hunger for understanding that had already crystallized into purposeful action. As secretary, he would have been handling correspondence, organizing meetings, managing the lodge's growing collection of texts and teachings. In this administrative role, he wasn't just learning about Buddhism intellectually, he was living it through service, through the daily rhythms of a community committed to exploration beyond the mainstream. The Buddhist lodge itself was a fascinating gathering place of unlikely mentors. Led by Christmas Humphreys, a barrister who would later become a judge at the Old Bailey, the lodge brought together seekers from completely different walks of life. There was also Dmitry Mitrinovich, whom Watts described as a rascal guru, a complex figure who drew Watts into deeper philosophical exploration. These weren't traditional religious authorities in robes or academic philosophers in ivory towers. They were practical people who had been transformed by Eastern teachings and were now sharing their discoveries with anyone genuinely interested. Watts, at 16, found himself in conversations that challenged every assumption he'd inherited about spirituality, consciousness, and the nature of existence. The lodge became a laboratory where traditional boundaries dissolved, where a young student could learn alongside seasoned professionals, where formal education mattered less than genuine inquiry. And here we discover a profound insight that would echo throughout Watts' entire philosophy. Wisdom often arises from the most unexpected places. It wasn't emerging from established institutions or traditional hierarchies, but from this small, dedicated community of seekers who had found each other despite their differences. The Buddhist lodge taught Watts something crucial, that profound understanding isn't the exclusive domain of ancient lineages or academic specialists. It can emerge wherever people come together with genuine curiosity and mutual respect for each other's journey. Watts was experiencing firsthand what he would later articulate, that the separate self with its isolated knowledge is an illusion. True understanding arises through interconnection, through the creative synthesis that happens when different perspectives meet and merge in the space of shared exploration. In our contemporary moment, when communities seem increasingly fragmented and people often feel isolated in their search for meaning, Watts' early experience offers something invaluable. He discovered that the most transformative learning happens not in isolation, but in community, in finding others who are asking the deeper questions and creating space for authentic exploration. Today, whether we seek understanding through meditation groups, philosophical circles, online communities of inquiry, or simply conversations with unlikely mentors, we can apply this insight. The wisdom we seek isn't hidden in distant mountains or ancient texts alone. It emerges in the living connections we forge with others who share our hunger for truth. As we prepare for the deeper teachings that await us, we can carry forward this understanding that the separate journey toward wisdom is itself an illusion, and that our deepest discoveries happen when we allow ourselves to be mentored by life itself, in all its unexpected forms. Yet even as Watts immersed himself in the Buddhist lodge, conventional society expected a different trajectory. What if failure is simply the universe nudging you toward your true path? Alan Watts's unsuccessful Oxford essay pushed him away from academia and into experiential learning. This highlighted his belief that intellectualism alone cannot grasp reality. Tonight, we explore how this moment of apparent defeat became the doorway to one of the most profound philosophical voices of the 20th century. And so, we can gently turn our attention to that pivotal moment when a young scholar's academic stumble became a spiritual leap. Picture young Alan Watts at Oxford, surrounded by centuries of intellectual tradition, the weight of scholarly expectation pressing down like a cathedral ceiling. His essay, rejected by the academic establishment, felt like a personal failure, But what if we could see this moment differently? What if the universe has a way of redirecting us from paths that would diminish our deeper calling? Watts himself later reflected that this rejection saved him from becoming what he called a mere academic parasite. Today's pressure-driven culture makes this realization even more profound. In an age where success metrics define worth, Watts's story offers a radical invitation to trust the intelligence of apparent setbacks. This experience crystallized one of Watts's most enduring insights, that reality cannot be grasped through intellectual analysis alone. He began to understand that the deepest truths, like the interconnected nature of existence, the illusion of the separate self, must be experienced, not merely thought about. This became the foundation of his entire philosophical approach. While his former peers remained trapped in the ivory tower of pure intellect, Watts was already learning to think with his whole being. The failed essay was actually a successful initiation into a different kind of knowing, one that engaged not just the mind, but the body, emotions, and that mysterious thing we call intuition. In our modern context, where social media metrics and productivity apps measure our every move, Watts's story feels particularly prescient. We live in a culture that treats failure as final, but what if we could embrace it as information? What if the job rejection, the creative block, the relationship ending, could all be seen as the universe's way of redirecting us toward our authentic path? Watts discovered that sometimes the most profound growth happens not in our moments of triumph, but in our moments of being redirected. His failed Oxford essay was actually his first successful step toward becoming exactly who he was meant to be. And perhaps, in embracing our own apparent setbacks, we too might find ourselves being guided towards something far more meaningful than what we originally thought we wanted. In 1957, Alan Watts sat in the quiet depths of philosophical discovery, penning what would become his seminal work, The Way of Zen. In that sacred space of study, ancient wisdom met contemporary understanding. The scene unfolds with Watts' captivation by Zen's most profound rebellion, its radical rejection of rigid, linear thinking. This wasn't mere intellectual exercise. This was the birth of a transformative insight that would ripple through Western consciousness. The moment was electric with possibility, as if the very air around him hummed with the recognition that something extraordinary was taking shape. What Watts uncovered in those pages of contemplation was Zen's central paradox, that clarity emerges not from forcing answers, but from the gentle art of not knowing. Zen, you see, with its emphasis on zazen, that pure sitting meditation of just being, teaches us that truth reveals itself when we stop grasping, when we release our desperate clutch on certainty. The Sanskrit root of Zen is dhyana, meaning absorption, but this isn't absorption into nothingness. Rather, it's absorption into the flow of existence itself. Watts realized that Zen's iconoclastic nature, its tendency to shatter conventional wisdom with koans like, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" wasn't about creating more puzzles, but about dissolving the very need for puzzles. This insight proves especially prescient in our age of information overload, where we mistake data for wisdom and certainty for truth. The digital landscape floods us with answers before we've even formed the questions, creating a peculiar form of spiritual vertigo. Zen whispers to us across time, what if the quality of your attention matters more than the quantity of your knowledge? In our relentless pursuit of being right, we often forget the deeper art of being awake. Watts saw that Zen's simplicity, its rejection of doctrinal complexity in favor of direct experience, offered a radical alternative to our culture's addiction to analysis and overthinking. And so, this ancient wisdom becomes beautifully practical for our contemporary lives. Watts invites us to practice what might be called intentional not knowing. those precious moments where we resist the urge to immediately categorize, judge, or resolve. Picture this. Instead of rushing to form an opinion about that person who cut you off in traffic, you pause and simply observe the arising of irritation without feeding it. In boardrooms where decision-making has become a sport, what if we embraced strategic periods of contemplation? In relationships where we feel compelled to fix and solve, what if we practiced the art of being present with uncertainty? This isn't intellectual laziness, it's profound philosophical discipline. The goal isn't to stop thinking, but to think with the spaciousness that allows truth to emerge naturally, like a flower opening in its own time. Zen teaches us that wisdom arrives not through accumulation, but through a willingness to rest in the fertile ground of uncertainty. What if the individual self is only a pattern within a larger flow? This profound question that Alan Watts invites us to consider cuts to the very heart of human suffering. For most of our lives, we move through the world carrying the deep conviction that we are separate, solid entities, islands of consciousness contained within the boundaries of our skin. We experience ourselves as distinct individuals, navigating a world that exists outside of us, separated from others by the barriers of our own making. But what if this entire way of experiencing ourselves is, as Watts suggests, a kind of waking dream? Watts's reflections dismantle the idea of a solid, separate ego with the precision of a master surgeon, yet with the gentleness of a compassionate healer. He shows us that what we call the self is actually more like a whirlpool in a river, a real and meaningful pattern, but not something separate from the flowing water that creates it. The whirlpool seems distinct, yet it is entirely made of the same water that flows continuously around it. In the same way, our sense of individual identity emerges from the vast, interconnected flow of life itself. Modern psychology increasingly supports this view, particularly in understanding social connection and mental well-being. Research consistently shows that our sense of isolation and suffering often stems not from external circumstances, but from our mistaken identification with this skin-encapsulated ego that Watts so eloquently described. This insight reframes our entire understanding of identity as relational and dynamic, rather than fixed and isolated. When we begin to see ourselves as patterns in the cosmic dance rather than separate dancers, something remarkable happens. The rigid boundaries that once seemed so solid begin to soften. The constant need to defend our individual territory relaxes. We discover that what we truly are extends far beyond the contours of our physical form, reaching into the vast web of existence that connects all things. This doesn't mean we cease to be individuals. Rather, we become individuals who are consciously aware of our participation in something infinitely larger than ourselves. Like waves that remain distinct while never forgetting they are part of the ocean. As this understanding deepens, viewers can experience the profound relief of softening their rigid self-concepts and feeling significantly less isolated. The artificial walls that once seemed so necessary for survival begin to crumble, revealing the natural interconnectedness that was always there, waiting to be recognized. We begin to understand that the separate self was never really separate at all. It was always a temporary pattern in the eternal flow of existence, a unique and precious expression of the cosmic intelligence that dreams us into being. And in this recognition, we find not the loss of ourselves, but the discovery of what we truly are. Not isolated islands, but rivers flowing together toward the same infinite sea. Let this insight settle like a gentle wave, and rest in the peace of knowing you are part of something far more beautiful than you ever imagined you could be alone. But if we are not separate selves, what are we? Watts found in Hindu philosophy a delightful answer, one that transforms existential dread into cosmic play. In the ancient Hindu tradition, there is a Sanskrit word, lila, which translates roughly to divine play or cosmic sport. Watts was deeply influenced by this concept, and he found in it something remarkable, something that could transform our entire relationship with existence. You see, in the game of hide and seek, there is always someone hiding and someone seeking. But in the cosmic version that Watts described, there is a profound twist. The one who hides and the one who seeks are ultimately the same being. God, it or the ultimate reality, or whatever name you might give to the infinite, plays both roles. It forgets itself in order to rediscover itself, and in that forgetting, in that beautiful amnesia, the entire drama of existence unfolds. Now, imagine the scene this creates. Imagine life not as a burden to be carried, not as a test to be passed or failed, but as a game to be played. In this game, consciousness takes infinite forms, experiencing limitation, exploring possibility, delighting in discovery. You, with all your struggles, joys, fears, and triumphs, are one precious move in an eternal play that has no winner because there is no opponent. Watts drew this insight from Hindu philosophy, particularly the Vedantic tradition, where Brahman, the ultimate reality, manifests as all individual beings through the power of Maya, often translated as illusion or creative power. But Watts was careful to point out that Maya does not mean the world is unreal in the sense of being worthless. Rather, it means the world is like a grand theatrical performance, a divine magic show where the magician has temporarily forgotten that the tricks are his own creation. What does this playful cosmology mean for the fear that haunts so many of us, the fear of the unknown? In our modern world, anxiety has become almost epidemic. We worry about the future, about what might happen, about all the things we cannot control. We scroll through endless news feeds, seeking certainty in an uncertain world, and finding only more reasons to be afraid. But what if Watts is right? What if the unknown is not something to fear, but something to approach with the curiosity of a child playing a game? When you play hide and seek, you do not dread finding the person who is hidden. You delight in it. The search itself is part of the joy. This reframing is not mere positive thinking or wishful denial of life's difficulties. It is a fundamental shift in how we understand our place in existence. The challenges we face, the uncertainties that keep us awake at night, these become not threats, but invitations, not problems, but adventures. This reframing reshapes how we meet the anxieties of our present age. When you face an uncertain job market, when you navigate the complexities of relationships, when you confront the unknown territories of your own future, you might begin to see these not as cosmic punishments, but as exactly the kind of adventures the universe wanted to have when it became you. This is the transformative power of Watts's playful cosmology. It does not promise that life will be easy. Hide and seek can be intense, even a little scary when you are deep in the hiding or far into the seeking, but it changes the fundamental character of our experience from one of dread to one of discovery, from existential terror to cosmic curiosity. Let this thought settle gently into your awareness. You are not separate from the game. You are the game playing itself, and in every moment of uncertainty, every moment of not knowing what comes next, there is the hidden joy of the seeker about to find, about to remember what was never truly lost. Rest now in that playful mystery, knowing that whatever you discover, you are discovering yourself. In exploring Taoism, Watts embraced the idea that reality flows like water. He studied ancient texts to understand effortless action. This reveals that forcing outcomes often disrupts natural harmony. In a productivity-driven culture, this message challenges conventional values. Viewers can practice aligning with life instead of pushing against it. The ancient Chinese concept of wu wei, which Watts came to deeply appreciate, offers us a profound understanding of this flow. Wu Wei is often translated as non-action or effortless action, but it's far more nuanced than mere passivity. It describes a state where we move with the grain of existence rather than against it, like a master calligrapher whose brush seems to dance across the page without conscious effort, yet creates the most beautiful and precise characters. The Tao Te Ching teaches us that the softest things in the world overcome the hardest, just as water, despite its gentleness, can eventually carve through stone. This isn't about resignation or inaction, but about discovering a deeper intelligence that operates when we stop forcing and start flowing. When we observe water in nature, we witness this principle in its purest form. A river doesn't struggle to find its way to the sea. It simply follows the path of least resistance, yet it reaches every destination eventually. It doesn't demand that mountains move for its passage, but somehow finds its way around, over or through obstacles. Watts recognized that our human tendency to impose our will upon reality often creates unnecessary suffering. We push when we could wait, we force when we could allow, we control when we could trust. The ancient Taoist masters understood that there is a vast difference between acting from ego-driven desire and acting from what they called Wu Wei, a state where our actions emerge from a deeper wisdom that knows when to move and when to rest. In our modern world of endless productivity metrics and optimization culture, this ancient wisdom feels almost revolutionary. We're taught to hustle harder, push further, and never settle for good enough. Yet Watts points us toward a different path, one that honors the natural rhythms of life. A tree grows without strain, without forcing its branches to spread, without rushing the seasons. It simply becomes what it is, trusting in an intelligence far greater than conscious planning. This doesn't mean we should abandon our ambitions or responsibilities, but rather that we might approach them with a different quality of presence. Less fighting, more dancing. Less forcing, more flowing. The paradox that the Taoists revealed is that sometimes the most effective action is the action that appears to do nothing at all. And so, as we prepare for rest, let us carry this understanding, that in learning to flow like water, we discover a peace that comes not from controlling life, but from moving in harmony with its eternal current. Watts's exploration of Eastern philosophy had given him a conceptual framework for understanding consciousness. But in the experimental 1960s, he would encounter direct experiences that pushed even his expansive understanding to new frontiers. In laboratories and private sessions, Alan Watts took his philosophical investigations into uncharted territories of human consciousness, not merely as an observer, but as a willing participant in the grandest of all experiments, that of the mind discovering its own nature. He engaged directly with visionaries like Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, entering into dialogues that would reshape how we understand the boundaries of perception itself. Watts's writings from this period, particularly in The Joyous Cosmology, reveal a man who had glimpsed something extraordinary. That perception is far more fluid, more malleable than our everyday minds dare to imagine. Through these altered states, he began to understand that what we call reality might be less like a solid wall and more like a shimmering field of possibility, constantly shifting, endlessly creative. The confident ego we carry through daily life appeared as nothing more than a useful construct, a convenient fiction that could be gently set aside when the time was right. In his characteristic way, Watts compared this to finally being able to hang up the phone on our persistent internal chatter, the endless monologue that narrows our awareness to a single frequency when infinite channels are available. Through these explorations, He discovered that consciousness could expand beyond its usual boundaries, revealing capacities for insight and connection that our ordinary waking state barely suspects. Today, as society reconsiders the therapeutic potential of substances that alter perception for treating depression, anxiety, and trauma, Watts's insights feel remarkably prescient. Modern research is confirming what he intuited through his own explorations, that consciousness is far more flexible than most assume, and that temporary dissolution of the ego can lead to profound healing and renewal. You might wonder, what would happen if you approached your own daily experiences with a fraction of this flexibility? What if, instead of being trapped by rigid patterns of thought, you began to see your own mind as a creative artist capable of reshaping your experience of reality? Alan Watts saw something profound that most of his contemporaries missed. Western therapy and Eastern liberation are speaking the same language. He argued that dropping dualism is the key to healing. This insight challenges the artificial division between mind and body. As mental health becomes a global conversation, integration is vital. Viewers can apply this by seeking holistic approaches to well-being. Alan Watts saw something profound that most of his contemporaries missed, that the therapeutic process and the spiritual journey were not merely similar, but fundamentally identical in their deepest purpose. While Western psychology was developing its understanding of the unconscious mind, and Eastern traditions spoke of liberation from suffering, Watts recognized both as different languages describing the same essential human predicament, the illusion of separation from our true nature. He observed how traditional therapy often helped individuals feel more integrated, more whole, more at peace with themselves, and realized this was essentially the same movement toward what Eastern traditions call enlightenment or liberation from the egoic sense of being a separate self. This recognition led Watts to challenge one of the most persistent and problematic dualisms in Western thought, the artificial division between mind and body. He pointed out how this separation has created enormous suffering, forcing people to live as if they were split beings, as if their thoughts, emotions, and psychological processes were somehow disconnected from their physical experience, their breath, their heartbeat, their embodied existence in the world. Watts argued that this mind-body split was itself a form of psychological fragmentation, a symptom of the deeper illusion that we are separate selves trying to manage our inner world while simultaneously living in an external reality. True healing, whether in therapy or in spiritual practice, begins when we recognize that this division is an illusion. Today, as mental health becomes a global conversation and awareness of psychological well-being spreads across cultures, Watts' insights feel more relevant than ever. We see the emergence of mindfulness-based therapies, the integration of Eastern contemplative practices with Western psychology, and a growing recognition that authentic healing requires a holistic approach, one that honors both the psychological insights of the therapeutic process and the profound liberation offered by non-dual awareness. When we seek approaches to well-being that transcend the artificial boundaries between mind and body, between personal healing and universal liberation, we begin to walk the path that Watts saw as the deepest form of therapy. The recognition that the separate self-seeking healing was never truly separate to begin with. In writing his favorite work, Watts explored human estrangement from nature. The scene shows him contemplating natural rhythms, sitting beneath the ancient oak where he often sought wisdom. His mind wandered through the cycles of seasons, the breath of wind through leaves, the patient persistence of growing things. In these moments of quiet observation, he discovered something profound about the artificial barriers we construct between ourselves and the living world around us. This reveals that harmony arises when we stop seeing ourselves as separate from the world. Watts understood that the human tendency to view nature as something out there, separate from our daily lives, our urban environments, our technological pursuits, creates a fundamental illusion of isolation. We experience ourselves as observers standing apart from the natural world, as if we were visitors to a museum rather than living exhibits within it. But nature itself knows no such separation. The tree draws sustenance from soil and sky, the river flows through stone and valley, the wind carries seeds across continents, all participating in an eternal dance of mutual belonging. Today's ecological crises highlight this disconnection painfully. When we treat the earth as mere resource to be consumed, when we poison rivers with industrial waste or clear ancient forests for short-term profit, we are quite literally attacking ourselves. The climate crisis, the extinction of species, the pollution of oceans, all stem from this fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship with the natural world. Watts would observe that we cannot stand apart from nature and master it without ultimately destroying the very systems that sustain us. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food that nourishes us, they are not separate from us, but expressions of the same living intelligence that flows through all existence. Viewers can cultivate deeper respect and reciprocity with nature by beginning with small, conscious shifts in perception. Instead of viewing a forest as mere timber to be harvested, we might see it as a vast community of interconnected beings working together to purify air, regulate climate, and nurture countless forms of life. When we eat, we might pause to recognize the sun, soil, rain, and countless creatures that made this meal possible. When we breathe, we might feel our lungs as part of the same atmospheric system that sustains all breathing beings. Even in our cities, we can create small spaces of reciprocity, a window box of herbs, a bird feeder, a meditation on the rhythms of dawn and dusk. For Watts, this isn't merely environmentalism, it's the recognition that to harm nature is to harm ourselves, and to nurture the natural world is to nurture our own deepest being. The healing of our planet begins with the healing of this fundamental relationship, seeing ourselves not as rulers of nature, but as participants in its eternal, creative dance. What if trying to control life is the very thing that makes us anxious? This seems counterintuitive at first glance, doesn't it? In our modern world, we're constantly bombarded with messages about productivity, self-improvement, and the relentless pursuit of mastery over our circumstances. We're taught that success comes through willpower, strategic planning, and an iron grip on our futures. Yet Alan Watts, with his characteristic gentle wisdom, suggests that this very orientation toward control might be the source of our deepest anxiety. Watts would often point out that we live as if we're separate islands, each responsible for single-handedly building fortresses against an uncertain world. We construct elaborate systems of control, careers, relationships, financial plans, health regimens, as if these structures could somehow shield us from life's inherent unpredictability. But here's where the paradox emerges. The tighter we grip, the more anxiety we create. It's like clutching sand in our fists. The harder we squeeze, the faster it escapes between our fingers. This insight becomes particularly relevant in our current era of burnout culture. We live in a time when anxiety disorders are epidemic, when mental health crises are reaching unprecedented levels, and when the very systems we built to create security have become sources of relentless pressure. Watts would observe that we've created a civilization based on the illusion that we can and should control everything, when in reality, we're far more like dancers in an improvisational performance than conductors orchestrating a predetermined score. And so, we arrive at a radical proposition. letting go becomes not a sign of weakness or failure, but an act of profound wisdom. Watts teaches us that surrender doesn't mean passive acceptance or resignation from life. Rather, it means releasing our desperate need to orchestrate every outcome and instead learning to flow with the natural rhythm of existence. When we release unrealistic expectations, when we stop demanding that life conform to our rigid blueprints, we discover a deeper form of strength that comes not from controlling, but from trusting the intelligence inherent in life itself. This is the strength of the bamboo that bends in the storm rather than the rigid oak that breaks. When Watts explained that free will and determinism are not opposites, he invited a new understanding that dissolves the very foundations of how we typically think about choice and control. This paradox, which has puzzled philosophers for millennia, becomes something entirely different when viewed through the lens of Eastern wisdom, that ancient understanding which recognizes the flowing, interconnected nature of reality itself. What if the very question, "Do I have free will?" contains within it a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of self and causation? What if freedom and necessity are not opposing forces, but rather different aspects of the same flowing reality? Consider the simple act of choosing what to have for breakfast. On the surface, it appears as though you freely select between options, perhaps cereal or toast, coffee or tea. Yet when we examine this decision more closely, we discover layers of causation that seem to remove any true freedom. Your preference for coffee might be shaped by genetics, past experiences, cultural conditioning, the current state of your nervous system, even the quantum fluctuations in your brain. Each choice appears predetermined by causes extending far beyond your conscious awareness. But here lies the beautiful paradox Watts illuminates. This recognition of causation doesn't diminish your freedom. It reveals a deeper understanding of what freedom actually means. Just as a river appears to flow freely while being completely determined by the landscape it traverses, your choices unfold within the natural flow of causality without being any less authentic. Modern neuroscience has begun to echo this ancient wisdom in remarkable ways. Experiments by researchers like Benjamin Libet in the 1980s showed that brain activity preparing for voluntary movements begins several hundred milliseconds before we become consciously aware of our intention to move. This discovery was interpreted by some as evidence that free will is an illusion, that our decisions are made unconsciously and then justified by our minds afterward. But Watts would have pointed to the deeper truth. This doesn't destroy free will. It reveals a more nuanced understanding of consciousness itself. Your awareness doesn't need to precede every neural process to be genuine. Like the conductor of an orchestra who doesn't create each individual sound but coordinates the symphony, conscious awareness works with, rather than against, the automatic processes of mind and brain. The freedom lies not in controlling every neural event, but in the capacity to observe, understand, and align with the deeper currents of your own being. This understanding brings profound liberation from the harsh self-judgment that often accompanies traditional views of free will. When we believe we should have complete control over our thoughts, emotions, and actions, every perceived failure becomes a personal defect, every mistake a moral failing. But Watts invites us to embrace a different relationship with responsibility, one that acknowledges the complex web of causation while still honoring our capacity for conscious response. You remain accountable for your actions, not because you are the sole author of your choices, but because you are the conscious participant in the ongoing flow of causality. Like a skilled surfer who doesn't control the ocean, but responds skillfully to its waves, your freedom emerges through awareness rather than force. This awareness allows you to distinguish between the aspects of your experience you can influence and those you cannot, between automatic reaction and conscious response, between being driven by unconscious patterns and skillfully engaging with the energy of life itself. In this understanding, responsibility becomes not a burden, but a natural expression of awareness, meeting the world with open eyes. What if the pursuit of success is simply a cultural game we mistake for reality? Alan Watts invites us to pause in this relentless pursuit and ask, what exactly are we chasing, and why does it feel so urgent? Picture yourself walking through an elaborate maze, moving with intense focus, breathlessly navigating each turn, convinced that somewhere ahead lies the perfect life, the ultimate achievement that will finally make you worthy, complete. But what if this maze, the entire structure of competitive success, status symbols, financial milestones, was itself a creation of our collective imagination? What if we've built this intricate game and then forgotten that we made it? Watts reveals with gentle precision how we've constructed the very framework of social goals that now grip us so tightly. Think of money, not as evil, but as tokens in an enormous game we've all agreed to play. The real question isn't whether you have enough tokens, but whether you've stepped back to observe the rules of this game. Notice how we've been taught to measure human worth by net worth, to confuse success with self-worth, to believe that accumulating more will somehow fill the deeper longing within. This insight doesn't ask you to abandon all goals, but to recognize them as chosen games rather than absolute realities. And in that recognition lies an unexpected freedom. In our hyper-competitive world, Watts's message arrives like a cool breeze through a stuffy room. Every interaction risks becoming a subtle competition for status or validation, every achievement a rung on an endless ladder. But what if you could observe this entire spectacle with the detachment of someone watching clouds drift across the sky? The pressure doesn't disappear, but it transforms from something that owns you into something you're consciously choosing or not choosing to play. You might still play the game, but now you're playing it with awareness rather than being played by it. This is the difference between being a conscious participant and an unconscious prisoner of cultural expectations. And so, with this understanding, we can gently redefine success itself, not as climbing above others, but as finding deeper connection with the flowing nature of life. Perhaps success becomes helping others rather than surpassing them, creating beauty rather than accumulating wealth, finding joy in the simple act of being rather than constantly becoming something else. In this redefinition, we don't reject ambition, but transmute it into something more sustainable, more aligned with our deeper nature. The competitive fire doesn't extinguish. It simply burns with a cleaner flame, warming rather than consuming. And in this liberation from the endless pursuit of external validation, we discover what Watts always pointed toward, that the life we were seeking was already here, waiting patiently for us to stop running long enough to recognize it. When Watts discussed anxiety as resisting the present moment, he offered a powerful reinterpretation. The scene watches an anxious mind looping in anticipation. This reveals that fear often comes from imagining futures that never arrive. Modern mindfulness movements echo this truth. Viewers can ground themselves by gently returning to now. Alan Watts understood anxiety not as a malfunction of the mind, but as a fundamental misunderstanding of time itself. He observed how we live in perpetual anticipation, constantly preparing for a future that arrives only to become another moment of preparation. This anxious loop, he noted, is the ego's attempt to control the uncontrollable flow of existence. Watts drew from Eastern philosophy, particularly Zen Buddhism's emphasis on impermanence, to show how our resistance to uncertainty creates the very suffering we fear. His teachings suggest that anxiety dissolves not through more thinking, but through a deeper acceptance of life's inherent unpredictability. Today, this wisdom resonates powerfully in our age of perpetual anticipation and constant mental movement. The modern mindfulness movement, from therapeutic settings to contemplative practices, essentially teaches what Watts described decades ago: the profound peace available when we gently return our attention to the present moment. Our contemporary culture encourages us to constantly compare, to endlessly scroll through possibilities, to live anywhere but here. Watts would smile knowingly at this, recognizing our ancient human tendency to resist the simple reality that each moment contains its own completeness. The breath, the sound of rain, the feeling of feet on earth. These simple anchors bring us home to where life actually happens. So tonight, as you rest into sleep, remember that anxiety is not your enemy but a messenger, pointing toward moments where you might be fighting the current of existence. Practice this gentle art of return, not through force, but through the soft invitation to simply be here, where the future has not yet arrived and the past has already dissolved. In this present moment, you are already whole. When Watts explained that other people reflect parts of ourselves, he offered a radical view of connection. This insight dissolves the fundamental illusion that we are isolated islands, separate and alone in the vast ocean of existence. Instead, he invites us to recognize that every person we encounter serves as a mirror, a crystalline surface that reveals hidden aspects of our own being. When someone irritates us, when we feel drawn to another, when we find ourselves judging or being judged, these moments become profound opportunities for self-discovery rather than obstacles to avoid. Consider this ancient teaching within the framework of non-dualism, the understanding that at the deepest level, there is no fundamental separation between self and other. Watts drew from Eastern wisdom traditions that speak of a unified field of consciousness, where what appears to be individual beings are actually expressions of the same living reality. When we encounter another person, we are encountering ourselves reflected back through the lens of human experience. The angry driver who cuts us off reveals our own capacity for aggression. The compassionate friend shows us our potential for kindness. The difficult family member illuminates our own stubborn patterns. Each relationship becomes a laboratory for understanding the full spectrum of human consciousness. This mirror principle transforms how we approach conflict and intimacy in ways that feel revolutionary. Instead of viewing disagreements as battles between separate entities defending their territory, we begin to see them as surface ripples on the deeper ocean of our shared being. When tension arises in a relationship, Watts suggests we might ask, what aspect of myself is being reflected here? What hidden quality in me is calling for attention? In intimate relationships, this becomes especially profound. The closer we come to another person, the more clearly we see both our own light and shadow aspects mirrored back to us. The person we love most intensely often becomes our greatest teacher, revealing both our capacity for deep connection and our fears of vulnerability. In our contemporary world, fragmented by ideology and tribalism, this insight feels especially vital. We often encounter others as opponents or allies, friends or strangers, rather than as mirrors reflecting aspects of ourselves we haven't yet recognized. Political discourse reduces complex human beings to opposing positions, yet Watts' teaching offers a radical alternative. What if every person we encounter, even those with whom we strongly disagree, is offering us a gift, a chance to see ourselves more completely? This doesn't mean we must agree with everyone or accept harmful behavior. Rather, it means we can approach all relationships as opportunities for growth, using even difficult encounters as invitations to deeper self-understanding. In this way, life becomes a continuous practice of awakening to our relational nature. one reflection at a time. And so we return to the gentle understanding that we are never truly alone. We discover ourselves in every face, every interaction, every moment of genuine meeting. Relationships become the living mirrors through which consciousness recognizes its own infinite expressions. Yet what happens when those mirrors become screens, when relationships become performances? Watts saw the dangers of identity fixation decades before social media existed, but his insights illuminate our digital age with startling clarity. His insights explain why digital personas create anxiety. This reveals how technology intensifies the illusion of a fixed self. In today's hyper-connected culture, his warning feels prophetic. Consider how social media platforms encourage us to construct permanent, curated versions of ourselves. We become obsessed with followers, likes, and the consistency of our online persona. Every feed becomes a showcase of others' achievements, every post a performance, every interaction a subtle competition for validation. This creates what Watts would recognize as the ultimate trap, the skin-encapsulated ego, no longer just contained within our physical boundaries, but projected and reinforced through digital screens, multiplied across platforms, frozen in curated images that claim to represent who we are. The anxiety of maintaining this artificial identity reveals something profound. The more we try to fix and control who we are online, the more we suffer from the illusion of separateness. Technology amplifies the ego's desperate need to be seen, validated, and differentiated from others. But Watts understood that this very need creates suffering. Each notification, each comparison with others, highlight reels, each moment of crafting the perfect post. All of these reinforce the belief that we are separate, isolated entities competing for attention in a digital landscape. The irony is that while we're more connected than ever, we often feel more alienated from our authentic selves and from genuine human connection. Watts would remind us that the true self is not a fixed entity to be protected and promoted, but a dynamic flow, like water that takes the shape of whatever container it occupies. When we loosen our attachment to our online identities, we discover a profound freedom. We can engage with technology without being consumed by it, participate in digital communities without losing ourselves in them. The wisdom is simple yet revolutionary. You are not your social media profile, your online persona, or your digital reputation. You are the aware presence that observes all of these expressions, and that awareness is infinitely larger than any digital identity could ever contain. In this quiet moment, let us turn our attention to a profound vision that Alan Watts carried throughout his life. His prediction that Eastern and Western wisdom would one day flow together like rivers meeting the sea. Picture him, if you will, sitting in meditation in his study, surrounded by texts from the Tao Te Ching and works of Western philosophy, seeing with his mind's eye a world where these traditions would no longer remain separate islands, but would form a vast continent of understanding. He imagined witnessing the day when a businessman in Tokyo would find Zen wisdom helping him navigate corporate decisions, when a university professor in Oxford would draw upon Buddhist mindfulness to better connect with students, when the ancient Chinese concept of Tao, that mysterious way of flow and naturalness, would weave itself into the fabric of Western psychology and science. This was not mere wishful thinking, but a deep understanding of how human consciousness seeks wholeness. Watts understood that the separation between East and West was largely an illusion created by geography, language, and historical circumstance. Long before the modern age of global communication, ancient philosophers like Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching some 2,500 years ago, had articulated insights about the nature of reality that Western thinkers were only beginning to explore. The Tao, which can be understood as the ineffable way of the universe, emphasizes harmony, naturalness, and the interconnectedness of all things, ideas that resonate deeply with Watts's own teachings about the illusion of the separate self. Similarly, Buddhist concepts of dependent origination, which describe how all phenomena arise in dependence upon conditions, mirror Watts's exploration of how our sense of individual identity is constructed through relationship and interdependence. Watts saw that these ancient Eastern insights were not foreign curiosities, but universal truths that had simply been expressed through different cultural lenses. Today, we witness the manifestation of Watts's vision in ways both subtle and profound. Consider how mindfulness meditation, rooted in Buddhist contemplative traditions, has found its way into Western psychology, healthcare, and even corporate wellness programs. Observe how the Taoist principle of Wu Wei, effortless action or going with the natural flow, influences modern approaches to leadership and problem-solving. See how quantum physics discussions often reference Eastern philosophical concepts, particularly in understanding the interconnected nature of reality at the subatomic level. Universities now offer courses that integrate Eastern philosophy with Western thought. Psychologists incorporate Buddhist concepts of suffering and liberation into their therapeutic approaches. Even popular culture reflects this synthesis: films, literature, and art that draw upon both traditions to explore questions of identity, purpose, and meaning. This is not cultural appropriation, but rather the natural evolution of human understanding seeking to embrace the full spectrum of wisdom. In our current age of increasing polarization and tribal thinking, Watts's vision of Eastern-Western integration feels more urgently needed than ever. The very separation he identified as illusory between self and other, between different ways of knowing and being, underlies many of our contemporary conflicts. When we rigidly cling to any single perspective, whether Eastern or Western, ancient or modern, we create the kind of divisions that Watts spent his life helping people transcend. But when we embrace what he called the middle way, that balanced path between extremes, we discover that the deepest wisdom often emerges from the meeting point of different traditions. This integration does not require us to abandon our cultural heritage, but rather to recognize that truth is vast enough to encompass multiple expressions. Like tributaries flowing into a great river, the wisdom of East and West can strengthen each other, creating a more complete understanding of our place in the interconnected web of existence. Throughout this exploration of Watts's life and teachings, from fevered childhood visions to the integration of Eastern and Western wisdom, a single thread has woven through every insight. This question carries within it perhaps the most profound and simultaneously most simple revelation that Alan Watts brought to our modern consciousness. Peace has been available in every moment of your life. Throughout our journey together, we've explored the illusion of separation, the dance of existence, and the gentle art of not grasping. Now, in this quiet space, we find ourselves at the threshold of perhaps the most practical wisdom of all, the understanding that the peace we seek has never been absent from our immediate experience. Watts's teachings consistently return us to this anchor point, the present moment, not as a philosophical concept, but as the very fabric of our being, immediate, accessible, and ever available. In our contemporary world, where global stress levels seem to rise like tides, where information floods our consciousness from every direction, Watts's guidance toward presence becomes not merely philosophical, but essential. He understood that the mind's tendency to project itself into future anxieties or past regrets creates a fundamental disconnect from the only place where life actually unfolds, the now. This insight dissolves unnecessary striving, not because action becomes pointless, but because we begin to distinguish between conscious engagement with life and the compulsive mental movement that keeps us perpetually out of sync with reality's rhythm. The beauty lies in recognizing that simplicity has always been our natural state, waiting patiently beneath the layers of complexity we've constructed. Watts often spoke of meditation not as an escape from life, but as a more intimate participation in it. In this light, gentle awareness practices become not spiritual exercises, but rather the most honest way of being. When we simply notice our breath, when we observe the quality of light filtering through a window, when we listen to the sounds around us without immediately categorizing them, we return to that fundamental simplicity that has been our birthright all along. These moments of awareness are not escapes from reality. They are invitations to experience reality more fully, more directly, without the interference of mental commentary that typically separates us from direct experience. The profound peace that emerges from this understanding comes not from achieving something new, but from recognizing what has always been true. Each present moment contains within it the complete resolution of all our seeking. In the gentle rhythm of breathing, in the simple act of being aware of awareness itself, we discover that we have never been separate from the peace we thought we needed to find. This is Watts's final gift to us, the recognition that returning home was never about journeying anywhere, but about relaxing into the immediacy of existence, where peace has been waiting patiently all along, as close as our next breath, as accessible as this very moment of listening. When Watts compared life to a dance, he invited listeners to savor rather than chase. Close your eyes and enter this vision, a vast, open space filled with beings moving in perfect harmony, not rushing toward some distant finish line, but flowing, twirling, stepping in rhythm with something vast and unseen. In this vision, there is no destination to reach, no trophy to claim, no summit to conquer. There is only the exquisite experience of movement itself, the sensation of being carried by music that plays through every fiber of your being. This is the profound shift Watts offered us. From the exhausting metaphor of life's journey, always going, always striving, always becoming something else, to the more natural rhythm of dance, being present, participating fully, finding meaning not in arrival, but in the very act of moving. And so, we can gently turn our attention to what Watts discovered, that meaning arises through participation, not pursuit. Consider how different this feels from our daily experience. We wake each morning carrying lists of achievements to pursue, goals to check off, destinations to reach. We measure our days by progress made, ground covered, obstacles overcome. But the dancer knows something else entirely. The dancer understands that the joy exists not in reaching the end of the choreography, but in the precise moment when foot meets floor, when breath matches movement, when individual expression merges with universal rhythm. In Watts' vision, we are all dancers in the same cosmic performance, each of our movements contributing to a pattern far more beautiful than any single dancer could create alone. This perspective offers profound healing in our goal-obsessed world. In an age where productivity apps compete for our attention, where every moment must be optimized, where success is measured by constant advancement, Watts' dance metaphor offers something radical, permission to simply be present. When we stop treating life as a problem to solve or a mountain to climb, when we release ourselves from the tyranny of constant improvement, something remarkable happens. The pressure dissolves, the endless striving quiets, and in that space of release, we discover that we were never separate from the music we were trying to reach. We were always part of the symphony itself. The dancer doesn't need to become a better dancer to belong to the dance. The river doesn't need to reach the ocean to be complete. You don't need to become someone else to be worthy of this moment. And so, we arrive at the deepest invitation Watts offered, to relax into life's rhythm instead of forcing direction. This doesn't mean abandoning ambition or responsibility. It means approaching both from a place of participation rather than desperation. When you make your morning coffee, you can rush through it as a task to complete, or you can dance with the ritual. The steam rising, the aroma unfolding, the warmth spreading through ceramic to palm. When you face life's challenges, you can fight against them as obstacles to your journey, or you can move with them as partners in an intricate choreography you don't fully understand but somehow trust. In this way, every moment becomes both sacred and ordinary, both significant and effortless. The dancer doesn't need to become someone else to deserve the dance. The music doesn't need to end for the movement to be complete. And in this recognition, peace arrives not as the end of movement, but as the dance, discovering it never needed to be learned, only lived. As we approach the close of this contemplation, we return to where all of Watts's teachings ultimately lead. Alan Watts's final message returns us to a profound acceptance. The greatest wisdom is simply to allow life to unfold, revealing that peace comes not from control, but from trust. In these uncertain times, this truth brings comfort beyond measure. Watts understood that our deepest suffering arises from fighting against the natural flow of existence, from believing that we must constantly direct, manage, and master every moment. But what if, instead, we could learn to soften into whatever arises? What if the ultimate spiritual practice is not striving toward some distant enlightenment, but simply resting in the immediate reality of this moment as it is? Watts drew heavily from Zen Buddhism and Taoist philosophy, teachings that emphasize Wu-Wei, the art of effortless action. In his book, The Wisdom of Insecurity, he wrote about how our anxiety stems from grasping at permanence in an inherently changing world. The ancient Taoist masters spoke of water, which never forces its way yet carves the deepest valleys. They understood that the most powerful force in nature is not the hurricane or the earthquake, but the gentle, persistent flow of water that adapts to every contour. Watts echoed this wisdom, suggesting that we too might discover greater strength through yielding than through resistance. When we stop fighting the current of life, we find ourselves carried by something far more vast than our individual will. Consider how this applies to our modern lives. In an age of constant change, economic uncertainty, social upheaval, and global challenges, the instinct is to grasp for security, to control what we cannot, to worry about futures we cannot predict. Watts would remind us that this very grasping creates the anxiety we seek to avoid. The peace we crave is not found in having answers to every question, but in developing trust in our ability to navigate whatever emerges. This is not passive resignation, but active acceptance, the wisdom to distinguish between what we can influence and what we must simply allow. Like a skilled dancer who doesn't fight the music but moves with it, like a leaf that doesn't resist the wind but rides its currents, we can learn to meet life's rhythms with grace rather than resistance. And so, in this final reflection, we return to Watts's most essential teaching. You are not separate from life, fighting against it, but life itself experiencing itself through your unique perspective. The separation was always an illusion. The peace you seek has been here all along, not in some distant enlightenment, but in this very moment of allowing. As you settle into sleep, let this understanding settle with you. You can trust life. You can trust the vast intelligence that moves through you, that breathes you, that dreams through your dreams. Soften now into whatever arises. Let everything be exactly as it is. And in that letting go, discover the profound peace of coming home to yourself, not as a separate entity, but as the very flow of existence itself, at last at rest.